we came from and what we proposed in the annual plan. So overall, and I'm using rough figures and rounding, so please don't nitpick about the specifics, but roughly the museum when it was open cost about $5 million to run. Roughly half of that came from admission fees and the balance came from the general rate. With its closure, obviously the admission fees are no longer there, so under that cost structure it left a significant shortfall. Decisions were made regarding the unfortunate letting go of the front of house staff, but when we had discussions with you around how to fund that activity going forward, there was a feeling that we wanted to retain the technical expertise during its closure, so then when it reopened, therefore that we wouldn't have to go back and secure them again, but also that there was sufficient work around the arts and culture space to keep them busy. In doing that, we shrunk the costs down significantly by about I think 1.6 million, but it did leave a $400,000 shortfall, and we were proposing to fund that $400,000 shortfall via a targeted rate across all households. Therefore each would pay $14.20. Now, recognising that as a deviation from the funding policy, which has the museum as a general rate funded activity. I think since going out for the consultation, we're understanding a little bit more now about the work that's going to be required for the museum. And as a result of that, and I'll bear with me, from an accounting perspective, we need to impair the asset, and that means we write down the asset in our books, which also has the flow-on effect of we're no longer depreciating a large component of that asset. Some of the costs that was left over that we were proposing to fund was a depreciation expense that now we believe will not be there because we will impair the asset. So therefore you could argue that there is no need therefore to have that shortfall rate or that targeted rate because that expense isn't there. Now technically that's correct, however the other element of it is that underlying this is in the capital expenditure side is that we had a $675,000 expense item which relates to the actual finalising the detailed seismic assessment, doing the technical work with regards to how to fix it, and then getting ourselves ready to fix the building. So while we don't have the depreciation expense and we don't need to fund that anymore, the cash flow that would have generated would have actually paid and contributed towards the capital cost that I identified before. So the recommendation is that since we don't have that expense line anymore, that we won't have a targeted rate to fund that. However, because we have a capital expense item that now is no longer fully funded as it was before, the recommendation is to fund that on the general rate. So what we're looking to do is increase the uniform annual general charge by $14.20 in lieu of the proposed targeted rate. Therefore still providing us the cash flow required to help fund that capital expense item. Is that clear as mud?
Thank you, Thomas. It's quite technical. Are there any questions for clarification? Councillor Tapsell.
Thank you, and thank you, Thomas. That is quite technical, and I'm sort of struggling to understand what that's going to look like for our households, switching it to that. Sorry, can you just explain what it would look like for the average household?
So I'll have another crack at this again because sometimes I do speak in a different language, so bear with me. When we reduced the costs and we were looking to fund the shortfall, and there was a $400,000 shortfall, about $600,000 of those costs that we were looking to fund was depreciation. And obviously depreciation is an accounting expense or a book entry. It's not actually physically paying cash out. So providing that funding for that $600,000 worth of depreciation, it effectively created a cash flow that was available then to fund this other expense which we recognise as capital expenditure. And so by removing that depreciation expense from an accounting perspective of your profit and loss statement, you've significantly reduced your costs and therefore you don't need to fund it. But you still have that capital item on your books that you need to fund. And so what we're proposing is rather than having that targeted rate recognise as revenue to fund that expense, we're putting it on the uniform annual general charge. It would still have the same impact as that targeted rate. Every household would still have a $14.20 increase. That activity would then have a small surplus of $400,000. So from an accounting perspective, it would look like it was having a surplus, and that cash surplus would be then used to fund capital expenditure with regards to the finishing the work to understand what's required to fix the museum, and then doing the design plans to do that. So if we didn't increase the rate, whether it's the targeted rate or the uniform annual general charge, that capital expense item would still need to be funded. And if we didn't do it this way, we would either have to not do it, which I think is not an option, or we would look to have to borrow to fund it. And I don't think that's an option either.
Thomas, can you just clarify, because the analysis of the submitters was they're generally supportive. However, what you're proposing, the recommendation is to be funded through the general rate, but you mentioned the UAGC. So if it's funded through the general rate, it falls, it goes to the capital value of a property and falls differently, whereas the UAGC is the same amount on every rateable unit. So we have a choice to make here. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. So we went back to the discussions that took place during the annual plan forums, where we looked to have an equal amount across all households. So if we were to place that on the capital value rate, then obviously higher value properties would pick up a larger portion of that expense. By putting it all on the uniform annual general charge, all properties pick up the same amount, and just like the targeted rate, you effectively get the same outcome with regards to everyone pays the same. Yep.
And that is the proposition that we consulted on. It was just a targeted rate rather than UAGC.
Correct, yes. So it's just moving it from a targeted rate back to the uniform annual general charge, which is effectively the general rate, and therefore it remains consistent with the museum's current funding policy, which actually says that as a general rate funded activity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the reasons why we were looking at a targeted rate was because as soon as we no longer needed it, it could be stopped. If we put it on the UAGC, it's not going to stop us, it's going to continue.
No, Councillor, we can reduce the UAGC in future years, exactly like removing the targeted rate.
Councillor Hunt?
But we could choose, instead of putting it on the UAGC, just put it in the general rate and let that be an uneven distribution, if that was our choice.
Correct, that is a choice as well. So somewhere between the uniform annual general charge and capital value and different variations of it is an option. However, we are recommending the UAGC because it is consistent with the approach taken in the targeted rate. When we went out for consultation, which I understand the public has come back to us and was supportive of in principle. Yep.
Okay,
So
is it just supplementary, is it regarded as a significant departure if we did decide to put it in the general rate?
No, it's consistent with its current funding policy.
Okay.
Yep.
Councillor Rotorua Tate and Councillor Kent.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that we went out and said that we were going to, have this targeted rate and consulted on that, and I'm a little bit disappointed to see that now we've decided we're going to have we've got another take on it, because the targeted rate was for a specific purpose that our community knew about, and so now we're going to change it, but the community won't actually. It'll just be lumped in, won't it? So the community was aware that this was actually for a specific purpose. And at some stage, we wouldn't need it any longer. It'll be off the books then, wouldn't it? So I think it's somewhat a bit disingenuous to introduce something like this now after the community has, had a good look at it and is aware of it and knows that this would be for a specific purpose for a specific time. I suppose that's our job, is to have these discussions, to debate it. But
and I think, Councillor, we can still do that. So I think when if this does go ahead, when we send out our rates assessments, we can put a communication in there with regards to what the increase is made up of and how it's going. And I think ultimately as well there will be a point whereby the museum reopens and so forth, and there will obviously be an expectation from the community and so forth that this is looked at and addressed as well.
So I'll just let the Chief Executive have a word here, and then Councillor Kent's question after that, and then Councillor Hunt.
So, Councillor Rotorua, I believe you were raising a point with respect to why the change. And fundamentally, I think at the point where the consultation document was actually developed, we were not clear at that stage as to the positioning of the museum building itself. It was still somewhat unclear as to the potential issues that we had. We're now today much clearer on that. We know the fundamental issues around the main part of the building now in a way that we didn't then, and hence the discussion that Thomas is putting forward is that we need to look at how we treat that or how we understand that with respect to the value of that building. And so Thomas's actually team's been working on that and coming back today with a recast view which has been informed by the piece of work that the engineers have been undertaking with the museum building itself. So some of the work that he's indicating will need to happen anyway. So we will need to look at a write-down of that museum building anyway. And so as Thomas has actually started to look at this, he's recognised, I think, to say, well, we probably can cast this whole problem in a different way, in a way that I think probably at the end of the day it's much more consistent with usual practice, but does, as you say, also need to be communicated.
Chair, could I just ask perhaps the CEO a question, please, or Thomas? Do we know then what the additional might be for the individual householder then? Or is it just going to be, will it ever be?
It'll still be $14.20.
It'll still be.
Exactly the same amount, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rotorua. Councillor Kent. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If it's $14.20 per household as a target rate, or $14.20 per household added on the UAGC, why are you putting on the UAGC? You're not achieving anything at all other than hiding it from the public.
Well, I know that in the past we've responded to requests on rate statements to be transparent about what makes up the UAGC. I don't see, Thomas, unless you can tell me otherwise, that we couldn't have a line in the UAGC that spells out museum recovery charge.
Deputy Mayor, like as said to Councillor Rotorua, when we go out and strike our rates, we'll be clearly communicating that the UAGC has gone up by this amount for this exact same reason. I think there's no intention whatsoever to try and hide it. As I said, it's just rethinking about how this worked with the things that are changing, and by putting it on the UAGC, it is now very consistent with its current funding policy as well, and so it just carries on with that.
So staying with questions, Councillor Hunt.
Really was mine, and that while I may have philosophically a desire to put it in the general rate, to share that pain more equally with those higher value properties, the community understand the 1420, and as long as there's a line in there that spells out in the UAGC and why it's gone there, which is obviously a flat rate for everyone, then it's again additionally able to be put in when required and removed when required. So that Thomas has essentially answered that question of mine, which makes it, in essence, very visible. And I understand the accounting things that you have to do to make it make sense at the end of the day.
Councillor Gould.
Chairman, thank you, Thomas, for your report this afternoon. Do you know how much the structural design plans are going to cost, or should we put some sort of limit and dollar figure to number 2?
Look, our estimates are we've allocated $675,000 in next year's budget for that. Now, obviously, as we progress, it may be less and it may be more, but as we know more, we'll obviously be communicating with council on where we sit with that. But that's our current estimate.
Councillor Maxwell, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For me personally, I was happy to go with the targeted rate, but I'm trying to appreciate what you brought forward in that now, Thomas. Can I ask that, because I don't know the ratio, but during the hearing submissions, were there more people against the targeted rate or for it?
So what we have in
Question.
page 97 of our agenda, in
Oh,
analysis of
97.
submitter points, there were 44, 26 against and 7 other. And so we've just amended point 2 there to make it clear that the proposal is that the 1420 is a line in the UAGC, so the effect on ratepayers would be no different to what was
Still
in the
1420.
discussion document. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions of clarification? Can I have a mover for the recommendation that Council agree not to introduce a targeted rate of $14.20 per household proposed to fund the revenue shortfall caused by the unexpected closure of the Rotorua Museum, and 2, that Council continue to fund the investigations and structural design plans needed to develop a restoration plan through the general rate, brackets UAGC, as per existing funding policy. Moved Councillor Gould. Is there a seconder?
Otherwise? I think
Mover and
it's-
seconder happy
Yep.
with that modification we have there? UAGC increased by $14.20 as per existing funding policy. Is there any discussion on the proposal, on the recommendation? In that case, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Against? It's carried. Thank you. So conversation number 5, we move on to conversation number 5. Proposed removal of the community board targeted rate. This is page 99 of the agenda, and Thomas, you again.
Thank you. I'll do this one on behalf of JP. As you recall, councillors, for a number of years, the Rural Community Board has been funded by a targeted rate. Following the establishment of the Rural Board and Te Tato, which we looked at how those boards would be funded. We felt that the best mechanism for that was on the general rate, and in particular Te Tato was already being funded that way, and so we felt the removal of this targeted rate to that community, which has caused some angst with that community in the past, should be removed, and the board would be funded on the general rate to be consistent with the other two. Now, just looking at the numbers, there were some for and against, and I think some of the against were probably of the view that those that benefit from those community boards should be directly paying for them. However, we do feel that it is probably fairer in this case to just put it on the general rate.
Thank you, Thomas. Any questions for clarification? For a start, Councillor Kent.
Thank you. We've basically been given two options here to do away with it or retain it, but there's actually a third option too, and that is that all three boards actually become targeted rates.
Look, that is an option, Councillor, but unfortunately we didn't consult with those communities on that option, so that would be something that we'd have to introduce next year. We would have to consult directly with them on that option.
Any other questions for clarification? Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Thomas. I'm just worried that we've got two boards. The community board's been funded, and as well as the Te Tau board. Why are we giving one board so much more money than the other? Is it because their advice is a bit more important to us, or? We seem to be paying the Te Tau board almost 6 times more than the community board.
Through Mr. Chair, have a suspicion that's about the difference between the community boards and their relationship with us, which is part of our elected structure. So we have formal arrangements under the Local Government Act for the governance we have for the two community boards. So they are part of council. The relationship with the Te Tato is that we have a separate funding agreement. They're not part of council, so we actually have a different kind of arrangement. So the funding that we've provided through to Te Tato, established after the Te Arawa partnership process, was that we would also provide funding for them to enable them to sort of employ an executive officer to support them in that coordination across Te Arawa, as well as their own board fees, and also a limited amount of funding to undertake some consulting. So that they are separate from us. So we've got a funding agreement that we have with an external partner, as opposed to the two community boards which are part of council.
And I think, JP, to add complexity, the remuneration for community board members is set by the Remuneration Authority, whereas that's not the case for the Te Tato board. Councillor Maxwell, you had a question?
Yeah, I had one. Originally, when this first came out and we only had the Lakes Board, I was for the targeted rate at the time, but like what has been explained to us, now that we've got the three boards working with council and more representative of the whole community, I support the recommendation that's up here. Sorry, it wasn't a question. Showing my support.
I think Councillor Bentley has a question.
A little bit like Councillor Maxwell.
Yeah.
I can't support this coming out of general rates funding for these sorts of people, and that being a residential voter, I can't vote for the rural or the lakes board, so therefore for me to pay their costs and not have them answerable to me is a bit of a misnomer. I'd rather see them held accountable by the people that they're representing, being rural and or lakes, and they are voted for by them to represent them, and so should be costed by them.
So I think we've had all the questions for clarification. Firstly, before we get into further discussion, can I ask, is there a mover for this recommendation? Moved Councillor Gould, seconded Councillor Hunt. So any further discussion, Councillor Hunt?
I'm going to support this because nowhere in the country are community boards rated individually as this one was, with a targeted rate. There are community boards established all over the country, and while this was a choice of the council of the day for reasons that seemed, quite sound at the time, we were an anomaly. We were a complete outlier around the rest of the country. And while I understand that the Rural Board wanted that accountability as well, they have that at election time. And as do the Lakes people. It's not contingent on whether there's a targeted rate or not. What is going to happen is that those communities will have actually far more say on what gets spent in their communities. That's not dependent, again, on a targeted rate. It's quite independent of that. That has been something that's been happening with the Lakes Community Board, and we've seen them go from strength to strength, and I expect to see the Rural Board have that same progression over time. So this puts us in line with best common practice around the country, and so that's why I'm supporting it.
Thank you. So next speaker, Councillor O'Kawa-Tate, and then I'll signal that I'd like to speak to it after that, and I'll take
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I concur with Councillor Hunt's decisions. And from my observation, sitting at the table with the rural and lakes representatives, I feel that their skills and knowledge, not just in the areas of the lakes communities and of the lakes communities, but their wider skills and knowledge add to the quality decision-making of this council. And so I would certainly support the targeted rate, because the whole of this community benefits from their decision-making and sitting at the table with us councillors here.
I'm sorry, are you supporting the targeted rate or removal of the targeted rate? Thank you for that clarification. If I can just have my say, and I concur with the two previous speakers, having sat on the, been appointed member of the Rotorua Lakes Community Board during its first 2 terms, along with Councillor Hunt, I think we've recognised the value that they do, as you say, Councillor Rokawa, make to the decision-making of council. But also it is the entire community that enjoy the benefits of our lakes, and I think the advice from the community board is not inconsistent with what's good for the whole community in those special areas where they're lucky enough to live. But more importantly, from my point of view, since then we had the representation review chaired by Councillor Rokawa Tate, and the whole community board bought into the idea of having the 2 community boards and a reduced number of councillors. So I think as an entire community we own this form of representation, and I think collectively we should pay equal costs of that representation. So that's my view. Councillor Tapsell. Then Councillor Stead.
Oh, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually was going to also bring up the representation review as well, and just to speak in support of this, of removing the targeted rate. Being a member on the executive of the New Zealand Community Boards, it is definitely an anomaly that we are the only community board that still has this. So with all of the good work that they do as part of our whole community, as we enjoy the lakes, they enjoy us too. I'm just happy to support it.
Councillor Stu.
An advocate for retaining the targeted rate over many years. This community board, the only community board we ever had a level of representation that other ratepayers didn't have, hence the reason for paying, and I don't resolve from that fact. However, things have moved on. We now have a Te Tau board, which is exclusively elected by the people who can elect them, a Lakes Community Board that can be elected exclusively by the Lakes people, and a Rural Board that can be elected exclusively by the Rural Board. So I don't see the 3 of them being any different. Te Tau's expenses and costs, whilst I understand the explanation JP just gave, is funded by the general rate, and to be, as a matter of consistency, the Rural and the Lakes Community Boards should be funded by the general rate as well. So I will be supporting that, having previously been an advocate for a targeted rate for that particular lot of people. And I just see, as we've moved on, that with the advent of the Te Tau board, things have changed, and I think all ratepayers are going to benefit, as Councillor Rokawa Tate said. The quality of the 2 Te Tau members and the 2 community board members on our committees has added value, and it's added value to the whole of the ratepayer base. So I have no compunction in supporting this motion.
Thank you. So we've had 4 speakers, I think, now in support. Is there anyone wishing to speak against the motion? In that case, anyone else wishing to speak? In that case, I'll put the motion that Council agree to update the funding policy to allow for partnership/community boards to be fully funded through the general rate. This will remove the targeted rate of $21.50 per property for the Lakes Community Board. Moved Councillor Gould, seconded Councillor Hunt. All those in favour? Against? Yes. Recorded? Yep. Carried. Thank you.
Just a quick question, Mr. Chairman. Confirm for me, is there congratulations to Councillor Tapsell, who's now on the executive, I would think, elected at their recent annual meeting only a couple of weeks ago?
Thank you for that, Councillor Maxwell. Yes, I think congratulations are in order. Can we note that in the minutes? Thank you, Carol. All right, we now move on to the discussion on the farming remission, page 101 of the agenda. And Thomas, the ball's back in your court to give us an overview on this one. Thank you.
Thank you. So you'll recall that this was a remission introduced At the long-term plan, it was a remission that was to provide assistance under, I guess, exceptional circumstances at the time. And those exceptional circumstances at the time were predominantly rural values, dairy farms increasing significantly in capital value, and then being revalued near the top of that cycle, and then the following year, the payout reducing from $8 to I think sub 4, I think, surely, but something like that. And there's a little graph on the next page that shows where that cycle hit. The remission was introduced and was applied to approximately 400 properties, and I don't have the specifics of each of those properties, but they were predominantly dairy farming properties, which effectively meant that the rate increase that they would receive in year one was capped and would be no more at the percentage increase of their capital value. And so there were certain criteria, such as the increase had to be above $1,000, and then all this other criteria. And so about 400 properties do receive it at differing levels. Now with probably the forecast payout, and particularly for dairy farmers in those circumstances being quite different, it's appropriate to reduce that with a view of the following year, obviously removing it completely at the next revaluation cycle. From the feedback, you'll see that the majority are far for removing it than there are against removing it as well.
Pretty straightforward. Any questions? Moved by Councillor Rotorua. Is anyone second it? And I'm happy to take second it, Councillor Sturt. Is there any discussion or questions? Councillor Gould.
Thank you, Thomas, for your report. What's the dollar terms? Is it still going to cost the council? Have you got a cap on when you said by 50%? $260,000, is that correct?
Yeah, so the total remission is being applied as 260, so there would be a financial saving of 130. Yep.
Councillor Sturt.
Just a question, Thomas. How many properties actually applied for and were involved in the 260, and how many could have applied?
We did the application for them, so we ran through the system and matched it against the criteria that we set at the time, and it was either 406 or 407, but thereabouts is the number. Properties.
Thank you, Thomas. If there's no further discussion, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Against? It's carried. Thank you for that. And the next discussion is short-term rental accommodation on page 104 of the agenda. And again, Thomas.
Sorry, I thought JP was doing this one as well, so it's okay. So
I'm just following the run sheet.
Yeah, I think I must have been away that day the run sheet was set, so I drew the short straw of it. Thanks, JP. So look, just this discussion as well. So this, just bearing in mind this came about as well, particularly was a certain set of circumstances in one of our suburbs that was causing us a significant amount of problem, in particular around noise and the amenity impact on that area. It's a problem that's throughout New Zealand, and has been a problem that many councils have tried to grapple with, but have struggled to undertake. And so what we wanted to do was to go out and have a conversation with our community around what are some of the things that we should explore, and some of them are obviously regulatory around the changes in the district plan, and the other one is around obviously rating and where those are participating in short-term accommodation, and they're benefiting from obviously the things that are happening in the market. Are they paying their fair share? And I'll leave JP to talk about the regulatory stuff if you want to expand that further, but from a rating perspective, our view was that at the time we looked at what Queenstown were proposing with regards to their quite complicated regime, and Thames Coromandel have also tried to implement one. And the feeling that we've got is that at the moment we're in a very reactive place. So when times were difficult in Rotorua, any growth was seen as good growth, and therefore when these issues were brought to our attention, we would react appropriately. And what we're suggesting is we just move to being a more proactive approach. And by being a more proactive approach, it's saying that where in the past we would have gone, we believe you may be over 100 days, can you please confirm whether that's the case or not? We would just change to saying, we know that you are over 100, please come back to us and with your records to show and demonstrate that you're not, otherwise you will be rated at that different level, and that will be rated just like all those other accommodation providers.
Thank you, Thomas. And JP will just cover off the RMA aspect of this item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just adding on to what Thomas has said there, it's been sort of raised as a discussion point which will obviously need to go through the RMA Policy Committee. So we're doing some initial work at the moment. Thomas mentioned Queenstown, but Thames Coromandel is another council that has been through some plan change or consenting requirements under their district plan. So we've got some background on which to look at the effects because we have to make sure our rules focus in on the effects, and really we're trying to find those thresholds which create a difference between normal use of a property and what is a short-term accommodation basis. So you start getting into guest numbers and the impact of guest numbers and the cumulative effect of it being rented out. And vehicle movements are probably the two key ones there. So there is some work underway at the moment, and so that will come back first to the RMA Policy Committee before it would come to Council.
Councillor Rotorua, we take questions for a start.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have two, and it's I'm not quite sure as to why it would go to the RMA Policy Committee. So perhaps you could just explain that to me. And the second thing is, in one of the options, greater than 100 days rental, then directly to full business rate. And I was just wondering, is there not a halfway house, excuse the expression, but between that going from, just the normal residential rate then to the full business rate? Is there something in between? So that would be just my two questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So I'll answer the second one. There is an in-between, and it's something that we do currently with B&Bs. So B&Bs where they are caught, I guess, with regards to the rules, is they pay the fixed component of the economic development rate, but they don't pay all the rest. So they don't get the extra pan charges or the differential on the general rate, just pick up a component of it. So that is an option as well with regards to these types of properties.
And just giving the other half of this, it is a double solution here. Thomas has obviously got the area which talks about the use of a property and how we identify that under the Rating Act. So we give a property a classification around its use, and that drives its rating. So that's where the 100 days comes into effect. So we're actually using that as a threshold around treating it as a commercial as opposed to a residential property for rating purposes. So that comes through a different process. What we had in the Tihatonga issue was a number of concerns about consenting. So how were they able to do that? And at the moment we don't have any particular controls on consenting, so we have to do that through the district plan consenting processes. Where there's a noise complaint or a vehicle parking complaint, we can address those on our current provisions, but we wanted to be more specific around consenting requirements for particularly larger short-term accommodation properties.
Thank you. So I've got Councillor Kent, followed by Councillor Kumar, then Councillor Bentley. We're still at question stage.
Thank you. I'm quite happy to move as stated there.
Thank you. We'll note that when Carol gets back. Councillor Kumar, you got a question?
Thank you, Chairperson. I actually am comfortable with the recommendation 1, but I think is the particular concern over here, as it says over here, is to be more proactive in monitoring and enforcement. Is there an area that we are struggling with? Is that why these problems are, I mean, in terms of abatement and issuing notices or prosecuting?
The part of the problem is property identification. So as to which properties are applicable to, obviously when people draw them to our attention, then we can tackle them one at a time. When we talked in the past during the workshops, is I think Bookerbatch, I think, is like 700-800 properties in Rotorua now, so it's growing exponentially. We can't data mine their website to gain access to that information. It's clearly not allowed, and their terms and conditions of their website say that. So we've got to just work with Bookerbatches and Airbnbs around getting a win-win for both, whereby obviously they're wanting to expand their service, but they recognise our issues and problems as well, and seeing if we can work together on identifying those properties, or alternatively just coming up with other measures of trying to identify them.
I'll allow you a supplementary question, Councillor King.
Thank you, Chairperson. My concern was more not on the 700 properties that are invisible to us, more on the policies that we've got in place and the complaints that are coming through on the ones, mainly Tio, Tonga and a few others, as to why under the current policies that we've got, why or how are we not being able to prosecute it? I mean, I've got Mike coming to me every week, talking to me. We have good, amicable, and I tell him that the compliance team and the council at large is working towards it. So I come back to the specific question, not on the 700 masked ones that we're still trying to uncover, but the ones that are there. Is it noise abatement? Are we struggling to sort of get that through, or what?
I may just address that. It's exactly in point 2 that when the district plan was done, this wasn't a problem. So the district plan isn't a reactive piece that you suddenly put in a new bit without working it up. This problem has arisen while we've had up to, 700 in the district. We've hardly heard other than this summer. So they've been managing in most neighbourhoods pretty well. And that's not to say there hasn't been noise issues, and there have been. But if we have a review, then we can look at, again, as vehicle movements per day. As an average household, there's a criteria for that. For a business at home, there's a criteria for that. And if you've suddenly got 15 cars turning up and they're all taking off 3 or 4 times a day, then naturally that's going to disturb that neighbourhood. But at the moment, there are no provisions to capture that. So when we have that review, it'll come through, it will go out for public consultation, and it's really important that we don't try and crack an acorn with a sledgehammer. We've got some outliers who have caused considerable discomfort to those neighbours, and there's no denying that in that particular suburb. But we have many communities that actually it's added quite a lot to those environments. And so we need to tread carefully here, because you don't make a rule for one, you make a rule for all. And so when we do the district plan, that what comes back from the committee will come back to council, and we'll have a full debate on it, and our community will be fully engaged in that.
Thank you, Councillor Hunt. Councillor Bentley, your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It appears that in recommendation 1 that this council is going to be taking on more costs to monitor and enforce something which we don't appear to be very interested in gaining any income from. And the second question I've got is, when is the district plan review due to come up again?
Just quickly, and Thomas will have to talk about the enforcement around the rating requirements in the 100 days. As far as the district plan is concerned, we're working on the rolling review. We've talked about that previously. And it's also a case of identifying where there is issues within the current rule framework. If you recall, we tried to do the omnibus of the whole district plan in over a 10-year period. Now we're still seeing where rules aren't serving us as well as they could, and so we immediately go into a review situation in those spaces. So you've seen the one come up on noise. We've signalled through the various O&M reports a few miscellaneous pieces, which has also included the research around looking at consenting around these short-term accommodation.
Thank you. And a supplementary then, when this review takes place, can we also put into that review home-operated businesses that may be drawing on council services that they're not paying for?
Yeah, so I think that'll all be part of the rating review in the LTP. So I have Councillor Sturt, then Councillor Tapson.
Mr. Chairman, whilst number one states we retain the existing policy, I want to know how many properties are captured under that policy, because I think it's weak. I think it should be 50 days rental. Because what we've got, Mr. Chairman, is 700 odd Airbnbs. We've also got Book a Batch. We've also got B&Bs. But B&Bs are different because someone's on site and they give that person a visitor experience, which is awesome. And most of the B&Bs in Rotorua are of high class, and you go on site and you can see the visitor comments. But it's the Airbnbs that are causing the problem. I think 100 days is far too long. I mean, if I buy a house in a residential street, we'll take JP's for example, he lives in Carlton Street, and 3 people either side of him buy houses in the upper echelon, because these Airbnbs are in the better areas, and 2 houses either side of him are Airbnbs. What would that do to the residential ambience that he bought his property for? And this is the issue, and I agree with Councillor Bentley with regard to home-based businesses as well. They are also having a major impact on the residential makeup, simply because of the costs to set up a business in a industrial or commercial area. So the backstop provision is the residential situation. So I think the 100 days is too weak. We're not capturing them now because we haven't been vigorous, and we have been vigorous, and it's taken 2 years to solve one that I know of in Ngongataha. We won't go there. But I think 100 days is too long. In 100 days you can get $15,000 in income. I agree with Councillor Merepeka Raukawa Tate. Based on these figures at the top of page 106, increases of 66 to 141%, that's grossly unfair. But when we do discuss this at length, Mr. Chairman, what I'd like to see is to quote some examples like the Lake Tarawera homestead. That's an accommodation situation. You've got Nikau Lodge in Ngongataha, etc., etc. And I think we need to see some examples of what these B&Bs are paying, because I want to be fair. I don't want to thump my rate, but we're in the visitor industry here, and they play an important part of that visitor industry. But on the other side of the scales, you've got all these properties that are now Airbnbs that used to be in the rental market, and they're not. The long-term rental market for families in this town, and that's why we've got a major problem in terms of our rented accommodation in Rotorua. So there's a balancing act. Whilst I'll support this as is, I'll certainly be looking to reducing the 100 to 50 days. I understand Queenstown's gone to 30 days, and I'm happy with 2 and 3 as per the bullet points.
I'm not sure if there's a question in there. Thomas,
Well,
did you want to comment on,
because how many have we captured?
And there's a resourcing issue there, so perhaps Thomas can speak to that.
The question there was how many are we capturing, and the answer is none. And as an example, you actually gave a really good example of Nakara Lodge, for example, and we'll pretend I didn't say that name, but it's on the record and on live TV now. There's a good example whereby we've had lengthy discussions with the owner-operator, and they manage it to 99 days. They do not go over, and we ask for their records, and they show us the records. So, and they are quite comfortable at managing their business to using it 99 days, and we regularly ask. So, it's one example. The other one's in Te Tonga, for example. We've written directly to all 3 of those properties. At first, they ignored us, and then we got a bit more proactive. 2 of those properties are now on the market. One, I understand, has now been sold, with the second one as well. So I guess that's the reaction to our approach to them, is they're electing to get out of that space. So.
Councillor Tapsell, you've got a question.
Yes, thank you. With the growing complexities of this, I think it is really prudent of us to make sure that we are well informed. So I wondered if perhaps we could have a slight amendment to the 3rd one to also include working with our CCO Destination Rotorua. I think that makes a lot of sense. They're the ones who actually look after things like the visitor nights. how many visitors are coming through, what are their expenditure, and whether they also include the eyesight or perhaps the eyesight separately, because they're the ones who see what are the visitor nights, what are the accommodation nights, and you can kind of weigh those up and see how many are going into the Airbnb when they are in here. So perhaps just to ensure that we're well informed in future using the great resource that we have at Destination Rotorua.
You happy with that slight change, Councillor Kent? And I applaud that one. So, yeah, look, I like the line of questioning. I think we're pretty much in line with, or on a consensus view on this one. If I could just add into the mix that I've had two whistleblowers, call them for want of a better name, enlighten me or advise me about holiday homes that are clearly, in their view and from their observation as neighbours of websites, being rented out for more than 100 days. However, the same two whistleblowers acknowledge that they also are on Airbnb themselves as living in their dwelling while people visit. So it's a tricky one, and I concur with the amendment as we need to move carefully. Yeah, but they're listed on the Airbnb website. So, Councillor Rotorua, you'd like to speak to the
Yes, thank you,
motion?
Mr. Chair. It's not a question, and you know, this town we've been wanting growth for a long, long time, and it's certainly with us right now. It's come upon us with a wallop, and this is part of growth. And times have changed, and there are people who want different options for overnighting and for accommodation, and if it suits them, I just heard that two people have decided they're out of that, and if there's a problem, and there have been some complaints, but I suggest for all of the people who do have book a batch or are on Airbnb, for all of the people in this city who have those facilities available, accommodation available, probably pretty minor numbers of complaints, I would suggest. And I'd like to think that we're not making policy here because people in the better, well-off areas have a complaint to make. You know, I think we should be fair, and I would like to think that we would work with the people who provide these services to come up with some workable solutions, because we don't have the answers all the time, and I know we look to other councils to see what they're doing, but sometimes the best people to give you advice are the people who are actually providing the service, and I don't actually know if they've been asked at all. So I'd like to think that we would not make a mountain out of a molehill, and that we understand times are changing and people have choices, and they want to be supported by a councillor that actually understands and appreciates that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and you supporting the motion. Yeah. Thank you. Councillor Kent, followed by Councillor Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to explain why I've actually proposed this motion, what we're looking at here is an annual plan. We've gone out and we've said to people, is this a problem? And if you look at the results that have come back, we've got half of them say it is a problem and half of them say it isn't a problem. Yet the vast majority of them say there needs to be some more regulation to fix the perceived problem. Because of that, it's not an annual plan issue, in my view, at all. It is a case of a thorough and proper investigation of what the problem is, the magnitude of the problem, and what should and could be done about it. And the mechanism is there to implement whatever regulations are required in the form of amendments to the district plan to address what is an issue that has arisen and wasn't there when the district plan first came up. So I'm wholly behind the concept of all the investigation, the discussions going on, and this being done properly to come to a solution. Because when you look at what some of the other councils have done around the place, they've tried to throw in a regulation and it's fallen flat on its face. So I wholeheartedly support the motion that this is the right way to go about addressing the problem, assessing the problem, and fixing the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kent. Councillor Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of the written submissions have made comments that short-term rental accommodation like Book and Batch and Airbnbs should be charged business rates because they are a business. They're doing it for making money for their own personal gain. So really it's unfair that the ordinary residents pay residential rates and these people come along, rent their places out, and they also pay residential rates. So again, we have to be very, very careful, but I still think that we need to have a policy and need to look at the policy in depth and get it right first time.
Thank you. We appear to have had 3 speakers in support. Anybody against? Look, I agree. I think it's both a rating issue, an RMA issue, but as Councillor Tapsell has indicated with her addition, it's a destination management issue, given the growth that we are experiencing in the visitor economy. So I'll put the motion that Council agree to retain the existing policy of 100 days rental and look to move to a more proactive monitoring and enforcement, continue to review its provisions in the district plan and undertake a plan change should one be required, and work with the hospitality industry, Destination Rotorua and the community to ensure that any future proposed district plan change does not cause additional unnecessary costs and or barriers to our community or the tourism sector. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Now is Rural Roads Seal Extension Program, which was not in the annual plan discussion document, but emerged as an issue from the Rural Board. So Stavros, welcome.
Thank you. As the Chair said, that this subject has not been consulted in the draft annual plan consultation process, but was raised by a number of submitters, including the Rural Community Board. And the basic proposal is that the Council increases its financial investment into the 17-18 financial year in order to purchase about at least 7 kilometers of rural roads seal extensions. As a matter of background, out of 1,000 kilometers of in our road network, about 134 kilometers of of rural roads are still unsealed, and the Council in year 3 of the current LTPI in 17-18 has a proposal investment of $700,000, which is sufficient to do about 3 to 4 kilometers of seal extensions for next financial year. The market at the moment, contracting market is not very predictable. The prices for rural seal extensions vary depending on the availability of contractors. But we do estimate this to be somewhere between $180,000 to $250,000 per kilometer. And on that basis, if we were to proceed to allocate enough financial resources for 7 kilometers, probably we need to invest somewhere in the region of $1.2 to $1.5 million. Because that investment derives an amenity, a primary benefit for amenity, it is exclusively funded by the general rates and receives no NZT subsidy, because under the NZT rules, the transportation benefit is very small to satisfy a benefit cost ratio. Other authorities have continued to explore some of these these issues too, and so we are not the only ones. Now, however, when we're resealing, when we're extending the rural roads select program, there is a whole range of considerations that take into account. For example, the number of properties serviced, the vehicle traffic, the volume of traffic, the crash safety record, historical and anticipated maintenance costs, and so on. The general rule of thumb, going by national data, is that every time we seal roads, the long-term management cost of sealed roads is about 4 times the operational maintenance cost of an unsealed road. And the basic fact, basic reason for that is that we're creating an asset with a certain value, and that asset needs to be depreciated and needs to be, renewed at a regular basis to maintain in a certain condition, and that is why NZT does not fund this kind of, of activity. This council had a policy which was developed for the first time in 2003, targeting 7 kilometers of roads, seal extensions each year. That policy was reviewed in 2012, and I think in 13-14 there was no funding at all for rural seal extensions. In 14-15, an amount of $400,000 was allocated, and in 15-16 and 16-17, about $700,000, was modified to accommodate about 3 to 4 kilometers of roads. That policy is basically sort of stating the general intent of gradually sealing unsealed rural roads, and the funding level depends on the council's set of priorities set each year in relativity to other investment priorities you said. What we're proposing for next financial year and what is in year 3 of the 17-18, anticipate to continue to spend $700,000 for rural seal extensions. And in terms of how does the general transport budget reflect the composition of our roading network? 70% of our roading network is situated in a rural area, and roughly about 70% of our transportation operational and renewal budget it's allocated to that, which approximately about $7 million per annum. Now, there are a number of reasons for this proposal. The community has been, from what I understand, for a number of years, been requesting for an acceleration of that seal extensions. There is currently a long-awaited list of about 38 years to go through 134 kilometers. By accelerating the investment, obviously, the aim is to bring it down to about 20 years. And obviously, another reason is that the rural communities anticipate an improved level of service in particular areas. And yes, there are benefits from the projects. The level of service will improve. The amenity value for the rural properties will improve. Will address community expectations, and obviously having a sealed surface, the maintenance needs are more predictable. And again, a sealed road has a less vulnerability against weather impacts. The potential risks is that in year 3 of the LTP, we do not have the funding sufficient to do 7 kilometers. And if we have to do that, we have to divert resources from other sources, from other projects. If we continue to increase the seal part of our roading network, then a corresponding renewal and maintenance budgets in the transport side needs to be improved at the same time too. And NZTA will consider that as a poor alignment with the one roading network classification system that using to provide funding subsidies to local authorities. And in some respects, by having a sealed road surface, we may achieve actually the opposite result of amenity, because some people might see that as more conducive to increasing speeds. In considering this proposal, we have outlined a number of options. One obviously is to because we have not consulted about it explicitly in this draft annual plan, is to say take into consideration, and when we go through the LTP next year, we explore the possibilities of accelerated seal extensions and methodologies of funding. In some jurisdictions, like in Auckland and Western Bay of Plenty, they allow ratepayers to have a targeted rate by which to substitute the NZTA for NZTA 50% funding. And again, that's something perhaps you can consult with the community. The other option, of course, is for use in your discretion to increase the capital investment in that activity by up to between $600,000 and $900,000 and fund it through the general rates or by date, or to establish this year targeted levy, which I suspect is a bit too late at the moment because there was no consultation about it. Our overall recommendation is that this council does not anticipate to materially change the level of service for year 3 of the LTP. However, we continue to provide the anticipated level of service, and during the 2018-2028 LTP deliberations next year, revisit the subject and decide whether the council considers that a high priority and the ways to fund it if this is the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. So we'll take questions for a start, and first up is Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to signify that I intend to move the motion that we increase the funding in the current year by $300,000, making it $1 million, and review when we get into the long-term plan process.
So I've noted that intention. Still on questions, Councillor Gould, then Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Stavros, for your report. On page 109, we got 2, increased net capital funding by an additional 600 to 900,000 to be either funded by general rates or by debt. In this document here, it's stated 595,000. So you're saying it's going from 1.2 million to 1.5 million? Or are you saying that it should start off at 600, somewhere between 600 and 900,000?
I understand the current allocation for the rural seal extensions in year 3, 17-18 is $700,000. And if we are to increase, we have set a target of 7 kilometers, the total funding allocation should be somewhere in the region between 1.2 and $1.5 million.
With the 2009 policy of 7 Ks of seal, are you saying we should talk about that next year in the 2018 to 2028 long-term plan to decide how much Ks of seal we do per year?
Yeah, that's correct. The policy was first established in 2003, but since then, in a number of times, it was modified up and down. And because this requires additional resource to comply with the next financial year, which is not in the draft annual plan, I'm suggesting that there's an issue to be discussed as an LTP priority investment in our consideration.
Thank you, Stavros. Councillor Bentley, your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question for Stavros with regard to the recommendation under the recommendation part. I could go along with what you're suggesting there if we just removed the word possible, so that we were guaranteeing the rural community a accelerated seal extension program from 18 to 28.
That's your prerogative.
I'll note that as well. So we've got an indication of an amendment. Yeah. Until you move it, it will be a motion. So we'll continue. Are there other questions? Councillor Sturt.
Chair, I've been around this place a long time, and I'm proud to say I was part of a team that actually started addressing in a serious manner the rural seal extension program, which prior to me coming on this council, and Councillor Max will tell you, everything went south to Rotorua, because that's where the bulk of the rural councillors came from in those days when the council was 17, and they put their hand up and they got the money. The north got nothing, Mamaku got nothing, Karoa, Rotorua, Maria, all those areas got absolutely nothing. So we set the policy, and you're quite right, Stavros, of 7 kilometres, and then the 7 kilometres was, for a good period of about 10 years, was costing around about $1 million a year. And then, of course, bitumen and the price went up, and the kilometres kept coming down. So we moved about 8 years ago, didn't we, Trevor, that we moved that the dollar figure stay the same, and the council staff deliver whatever that $1 million could provide. Some years they did 4 kilometres because it was very expensive. The next year they did 9. The next year they did 6. The following year they had a catch up and did 7 or 8. And we left it to the council. We said, let the managers manage. Here's the criteria, here's the points. You go out and you signal 3 years in advance what projects you're going to do. And that was it. The $1 million was borrowed, but when you're dealing with the rural community, I mean, we heard from some of the submitters Some of those farms are paying $30,000 a year in rates. And what do they get? Do they get a street light, a footpath? They get the road graded when they bitch like hell. And what else do they get? They don't get recycling because they don't want it. So other than their rural road being sealed and maintained, their $30,000, they question why they're paying it. Yeah, we could put up arguments why they're paying $30,000 too. Yeah. So I support Councillor Kent's that we increase the recommendation actually signalled their intention to move the council increase the current year 3 funding plan by an additional $300,000 to $1 million because we've already got $700 in the budget. So I'll be supporting that amendment, or that motion.
So to answer a couple of questions that are running around in my head and just whisper in my ear from the Chief Executive, I'll ask Thomas to join Stavros and present the options to Council as to whether an extra $300,000, if that's what we're going to debate, is either debt funded or rate funded and what the effects on either are.
So effectively, councillors, you've outlined the two options if you choose to do something different. So it's a combination of the two. You either put the general rate up by 300,000, or you put your borrowing up by 300,000, or a mixture of the two. Those are the consequences.
Councillor Tapsell, you've got a question? Is it a? Yep. Sorry, Thomas, I missed there the two options. So it was put the debt up by 300,000 or increase rates, and what would be the effect on the percentage if we were to go to rates?
So 300,000 on the general rate is just shy of 0.5%, so probably about 0.4ish or thereabouts. And the alternative is within the current funding policies that are available to council is to not fund that increase via an increase in revenue and fund it via an increase in borrowings.
Councillor Kent, have you got a question or do you want to put your motion? Yep.
I'd like to put the motion, but I'd also like to address what Thomas just said, because we've just saved $2 million off the capital budget, so it doesn't matter whether it comes off rates or whether it comes rates income, not rates increase, rates income, or capital expenditure. It's still the same rates bucket. However, let's proceed and put the motion, please.
So, Councillor Kent, can we seek your indulgence and ask you to specify in your motion that you would like to see it debt funded? Is that what you're saying?
So councillor,
It doesn't have to be specified whether it's debt funded or rate funded. It is out of this year's annual plan. Where it comes from is immaterial because we're still juggling all the numbers.
So just might be an opportune time to just where we're at. So the decisions that have been made so far effectively means that the level of rate increase hasn't changed, but the composition of it has changed. So where we talked about not changing the funding policy of the waste management activities from targeted rates to general rate, it just means we're leaving it more that. So the museum, rather than a targeted rate, it's now moving on the general rate. So the rate increase is the same, but the composition is different. The decision on the level of funding for the Sir Howard Morrison Performing Arts Centre means that when we've brought everything together and all the decisions that we've made to date, rather than borrowing $5.5 million, we're only now borrowing $3.5 million, which is 1.5 more than what the LTP had us in this year. So therefore, when you make this decision, you are saying, please now add $300,000 of capital cost in, which either means that if you don't put up the funds rate at the rating level, or it will end up on borrowing.
to that.
Councillor Stewart.
If you are able to make savings in other areas, you won't need to borrow the 300,000 or to rate for it. See, we haven't had the wash-up, Mr. Chair, where we sit down and the pluses and minuses, where the opportunities are to save money, etc., and that challenge hasn't been accepted yet.
So before we go any further, I think we need a motion on the table. And so Councillor Kent and seconded by Councillor Stewart wish to move. Is it there all at the bottom, Carol?
If you remove the debt funded, it is.
Sorry, Councillor Stewart, I missed your question there.
At accelerating the seal extension or not, and targeted funding options during those deliberations or not. I mean, it's pretty open-ended, but what the target is for this current year.
So, Councillor Kent, are you happy with the motion that's there? You moved that, seconded by Councillor Stewart. Can I ask Thomas to clarify what the impact of this is and how this will be treated in the annual plan if Council makes this decision?
Borrowings will go up by 300,000. Unless council come and tell me what else they wish to stop to do to save 300,000.
I'll just pass to the Chief Executive who's going to bring us back to the discussion.
Councillors, I think that we've got an issue here, I think, in terms of process. So the process that we've operated on in this annual plan is that it's an exceptions-based direction. So you've got a long-term plan out, and sitting in that long-term plan is a range of activities. All of them have got costs allocated and so on to them. And in this annual plan, we've gone out on a number of conversations which are exceptions. Now, what you cannot now do is to go back out and raise new conversations about areas of cost savings to try and offset decisions that you're making today. There is actually no opportunity for you to do this. What you can do and what you're doing in the deliberations is to actually pick up on the submissions from the community that have been made to you, things that they're asking you to do or to not do, and to deliberate on that feedback from the community. That's the role within this annual plan deliberation process. So within this context, what you've been asked to look at and what you are looking at is the Rural Seal Program. What you are now being asked to consider, and this is what I think the CFO is trying to lead you to, all things being equal from what we've seen so far today, and what we can see coming up tomorrow, this would mean that this is effectively an increase in the annual plan, and it would therefore actually have some funding implications to it. What we can't do is to ignore funding implications of decisions that have been put on the table.
I can't accept that. I find that absolutely preposterous, because it's a logical thinking. We went out and had conversations with our community on certain proposals. If we then sit here today and say the Sir Howard Morrison Performing Arts isn't going ahead, we don't have to go back out to the community and say, oh, we're not now going ahead with it, what do you think? I mean, we've had the conversation with regard to rural seal extension. The community's come back to us quite clearly and said to us, we don't want a dumbing down of it. Go back to the previous policies, and we're putting $300,000 more in the budget. And
look, Councillor Sturt, I don't accept that it's a point of order, because we went out for consultation on the Sir Howard Morrison Centre as an exception to the LTP. We didn't go out for consultation in the discussion document on rural
We're
sea.
now saying that we can't discuss anything other than the 4 or 5 conversations or change anything.
No,
What
I'm not
on
saying
earth is going on here?
Council can make a decision. It's just that, you know, it's what you're raising is not a point of order. Councillor Rotorua.
You've heard what the CEO said. If you think that we're out of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to just, and I appreciate what the CEO has just told us about the process and the need actually to remain with the process that we have to follow, so I understand that. I am, however, a little concerned because I would wonder, Jeff, if you're not preempting some of the discussions that might come out of either later today or tomorrow to say, well, actually, we're quite within the band that we had thought we might to get there, you know. So I'm just wondering if perhaps you've been preempting the outcome of some of the discussions later today and tomorrow. So we might be within pretty much on to this with the 300. So I'm just wondering.
I'll let the Chief Executive
Yes.
clarify, and that might
Perhaps
give
I haven't made
Councillor
myself-
Sturt some comfort as well.
Perhaps I haven't made myself clear, but I think I know what I'm talking
and
about.
look, Councillor Sturt, with greatest respect, I think we seem to be at odds as to what it is that I was trying to say. What I was trying to say was that you absolutely have got all right to make decisions with respect to rural seal. One of the things to be careful about, and what we're trying to advise you, is that what we cannot do is simply make changes. If all things are equal, and this is, I think, where Councillor Rotorua is coming from, if all things are equal, then this will actually have a funding implication to it. It may not, but if all things are equal, then it will do. What we cannot do, which was, if you like, something that came through from our PricewaterhouseCoopers report, what we cannot do is to make a decision to increase an activity and then assume that it's not going to have any funding implication. And that was one of the pieces of advice that I'm trying to make very, very clear, that when we make decisions such as this, if all things are equal, then it will have a funding implication. That's all I'm simply saying.
Well, okay, we're on the same pathway. However, to take your argument a step further, if earlier we had said we were not going to proceed with the Sir Howard Morrison upgrade, etc., there would have been funding implications for that too. So we can still have these conversations, and at a later date we'll say what the funding implications are. I've got no doubt about that, because that's why we're here, is to look at each of the submissions that have been made, agree or disagree. If there are funding implications, it sort of goes to one side. I mean, reading through some of the other implications, there's not much support out there for the airport redevelopment. So we may say we're not going ahead with that. And that will have funding implications as well. So this is, I think we're talking the same language, it's just in a different way.
So we are now speaking to the motion, and we've heard from Councillor Sturt. Obviously, you're the seconder. Not sure Councillor Rokawa Tate's spoken to the motion yet. I think she has. Councillor Kent, then Councillor Tapson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to point out that the rural seals extensions is in the consultation document and did go out to the public, and we have received their responses and we are deliberating on them. Thank you.
Councillor Tapson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm glad we're in the debating stage of this motion now. I do not support the motion that's there, quite strongly actually, because we are actually in a process of deliberations on the submissions that we've received. And I think it's very dangerous of us to come out with figures to add on to it when that's not what we have consulted, and that certainly was not the expectation of the community. While they may have, and there was a small group that said, can you please increase it? They did not say $300,000 and within this annual plan. So I think as prudent decision makers, we need to make sure that we're well informed of the repercussions of this decision. Because as Thomas has quite clearly stated, it's going to come out of either debt or other rates. And that's something that I certainly do not feel comfortable with. And I actually think would be an extremely, extremely bad move for us to go back to the community and say, thank you for telling this. We just made this random left field decision and it's not good governance. We need to be well informed on the consequences of this before we proceed, even if the mover and seconder wish for it to come tomorrow, but we do need to know the ripple effects of adding $300,000, because there are many other people that submitted that $300,000 would cover all of their small needs without adding on to something that we're already giving people. So I would just like to speak against this motion for those reasons, and in full confidence and belief that to not do this would be good process and good governance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Tapsall. I've got Councillor Maxwell, then Councillor Gould, then Councillor Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do support the motion because this is, if I recall, this is the way we used to fund rural roading in the past. It was a dollar figure. It was by dollars, and then somewhere along the line it changed to kilometres. It really distorted everything for me, and we didn't know what we were going to be spending. Whilst I've been hearing why we should, why we shouldn't, I think the desire is that we set a figure of it being $1 million, and I think the move in the secondary expressed that, and that's what I want to support. And I just hope even by the end of tomorrow it works out okay that we can. This is what we can do. Thank you.
Councillor Gould.
Chairman, I'm supportive of the motion. The Rural Community Board wants 7 k's of road sealing. This $1 million will probably be lucky to get 5 k's of sealing. The other thing is that the Rural Community Board area, they pay 11% of the total rates of $80 million. So they're not asking for much. They're just asking for a few road seals. There's problems in certain areas of town where the roads aren't sealed, where a lot of traffic is going through. One of them is River Kaitu, which has been used by a lot of trucks now, which is going to cost this council a lot of money in maintenance in the future because these trucks are actually tearing up the road. There's another road in Mamaku, which has got 11 houses on it, at least 11 houses, which again hasn't got road sealing. So this is just pittance of $300,000 extra to pay for maybe 1 kilometre of road sealing.
Councillor Hunt.
I'm going to speak against it. I think this is a long-term plan discussion for me. It's wrapped up in the accelerated sealing program, which I'm very keen to see put into place. I think it is premature considering we haven't looked at all the other submissions. This one has floated up because we have a rural board, and rightfully so, and it was a hot topic amongst them, and that's not a problem. It wasn't any more than lighting, safety and other transport renewals highlighted as a conversation piece. We had 5 conversations we went out with. We've dealt with those, our next part of this process is to look at all the other requests we got through and balance them in. And in the past, we've had a whiteboard and we've looked at, we've been given an opportunity to reduce our debt and to leave ourselves with a bit more cash at the end of year. Do we want to keep that? Do we want to tip that balance? That's a discussion once we've analysed and listened to all the other requests for improvements. We only put 50 grand into amenity lighting in some communities. Someone might want, and rightfully so for safety issues, 200,000 put in there. Is that a long-term plan discussion? Is it something we should make just off the hoof? It's not to say I don't support rural cereal. I do, because I know a lot of people not only use it who live out there, I know it also adds to our cycling infrastructure, it adds to our safety profile, and it makes us a more desirable community to live in. So there's no argument that I don't support it. Is this the appropriate time and place for it? No, in my opinion, it's not. It's a long-term plan discussion, which we will be launching into in August. So I guess one question I had from Stavros was, what exactly was another 300k going to buy us? Because if it's what is that going to buy us in the current cost of bitumen?
Well, roughly another kilometre.
Okay, so we're talking a kilometre here. And I think because the rural board, again, is still new, it's the whole of the rural area, I think this gives an opportunity for them to be so well armed come the long-term plan deliberations. They'll know exactly which roads, which bits of roads that they want sealed, and we'll be much better in the position to make a decision that's actually based at the right time, on the right parameters, with the right information. It seems a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction for me today, and I support my colleagues for supporting rural seal. There's no disagreement there, but I just think it's premature in light of our decision-making. Annual plan has changed from the old days. We don't rehash everything. It is exceptions based, and this has not come up as an exception. It's very much come up as a long-held desire for that community, and I support them for it, but I can't support the motion on the table.
Thank you, Councillor Bentley. You signalled you wish to say.
Thank you.
I'll go around the room if there's anyone I haven't missed, and then Councillor Kent, I'll give you a right of reply at the end.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking in support of the motion. The seal extension, by extending it by 300k, that's not an awful lot of money, but it is indicating to the rural board that we're very much listening to their requests, and yes, it may give them the feeling of getting a minor win, and that's what they're there to do. The fact of the matter is, when we're doing a seal extension, we're not only throwing a bit of tarmac down, we're renewing all the culverts and stormwater systems. We're widening the road, we're making it that much more safe, and generally we're putting down a decent base for which this tar seal goes on. So having experienced it out at Maniatutu Road, it improves the safety factor exponentially, and it also is one of the few things that gives those ratepayers in that area a feeling that, hey, this council is listening to us.
Thank you, Councillor Bentley. I'll have my say and then I'll pass to Councillor Kumar. So, look, I'm very much in agreement with Councillor Tapsell and Councillor Hunt. This is, in my view, an LTP discussion. There's no question that we haven't listened to the rural board. We've listened to them on the waste issue. And gone along with their recommendation on that one. Yes, 11% of the people live in the rural area, but 70% of our roading budget is spent in the rural area. So I think it's unfair to say that we're not giving them fair consideration in that, and that we are left with the opportunity of an accelerated program in the long-term plan. I disagree with the contention that it is something that we put out as a conversation, an exception to the LTP in the discussion document. All that's on page 22 is a table of our capital spend in this year's annual plan, not a discussion on rural roading. So it's come from the rural board. But if we impose what's being asked here, an extra 300,000, then we're imposing it on everyone in the district, not just the 11% of people who live in the community. And I don't think we've had that discussion, so I don't think that is good governance, as Councillor Tapsell says. So I would be against, and I'll now give Councillor Kumar the opportunity of saying where he stands.
Thank you, Chairperson. I actually support the 7-kilometre rural road extension, even though I don't live in it, but I now and again have gone into rural areas, and living in Rotorua, do quite a bit of it. So I think I support the extension.
Councillor Kent, did you want to write a reply?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The annual plan process, as we currently know it, is putting out significant exceptions on the assumption that what we've already decided in the long-term plan is set in concrete. However, this council seems to be under the impression that it can actually add in willy-nilly new things, such as upgrades of the Sir Howard Morrison Performance Centre, which is totally out of the ballpark, and yet a minor thing like a $300,000 increase to help assist our rural community and to help upgrade how the tourists see our rural community. And let's not forget that our rural community is just as much part of our community as our lakes community or any other part of our community. And when I hear statements like, oh, it's going to be an X% rate increase or whatever, I challenge that. And I have already stated to the Chief Executive that I require in writing an explanation from the Chief Financial Officer for the statement that he made earlier, because this council, in its annual plan, is proposing $39.992 million worth of capital expenditure. Its debt is only forecast to increase by 5.5 million. Do your sums. Only 5.5 million is increased capital expenditure. Therefore, the rest is coming from rates. And we are the councillors who have been elected to determine what rates need to be collected and what they're spent on. So 300,000 for a minor increase in the rural extension is at least giving some recognition to all our rural ratepayers that we actually support them as well. And we're there for them as well. So I urge all of you to vote in support of this very minor amendment, which is going to have virtually no impact whatsoever on the rest of our deliberations.
So I'll put the motion that Council increase the current Year 3 funding plan of the 2015-2025 long-term plan by an additional $300,000 to $1 million for rural seal extension, and considers an accelerated sealing extension program and targeted funding options during the 2018-2028 LTP deliberations. So that's moved Councillor Kent, seconded Councillor Sturt. All those in favour? Against? No. Carried. That brings us to the end of today. I'll just ask JP to explain why we will adjourn at this stage and be back tomorrow. There's some logistical issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We just had anticipated we'd end up with a 4 to 6 hour meeting today, so that's what we were sort of aiming at. So, councillors, you've moved through what we thought we'd get through today, so thank you very much for that. Really, the second day was intended to start going through the other submissions, and at this point it gave us the opportunity, and the logistics comment was to enable us to have the relevant officers in attendance through tomorrow to answer off any particular or specific questions. So hopefully that's a clarification.
In the process, Mr. Chairman, we've got a submission here which the lady makes a suggestion where she supports free admission for 70-year-olds to the aquatic centre. Now, we didn't have a conversation about admissions to the aquatic centre, but if we support that, are you going to say, oh, no, that has to go to the LTP next year? Because it's got financial implications. I mean, there's hundreds of them that are making suggestions on whether we should do this or we should do that. So if we don't make a decision on any of them and say, oh, no, we'll transfer that all to the LTP, what have we been doing?
I'll just I'll just let the Chief Executive speak to this.
So can I just clarify that? So the question really comes back to the significance policy for the organisation. So a particular resident could, for example, propose a new targeted rate. And quite clearly, the introduction of a new targeted rate is a significant decision which would require extended additional community consultation. So then what can you make a decision on? So what really it comes back to is the application of the significance policy. And so can you look at a particular item and say, no, this would be below the level of significance in terms of its financial impact or other aspects that you feel confident you're able to make a decision on. And on those sort of items, you're most able to look at individual submissions and make a decision as to which way things should go. Always, though, you've got to be mindful of the significance policy, and that requires you that where a decision is of significance and broader interest to a much broader community, then you are bound effectively to go back out for consultation prior to performing a final view on it. Look, can I just go back to this funding discussion?
Respond to that. One of the conversations wasn't the airport. We only had 5 conversations with the community. And I've had general disquiet about spending more money out there when the debt of the airport company is XXX. So if we decide not to support, do we have to go back out and consult people because it's significant or not?
No, we workshopped up the discussion document that we put out for discussion, and the airport is actually a decision of a CCO who are working within their statement of intent. It's not an issue for our annual plan. Councillor Gould.
On Friday, I collected my agenda and I was given a separate piece of paper on the submission process, which covers in pages 110 to 114. My numbers on my document are different to your numbers in the book. So does this mean the councillors today will get a copy of that full report or go with the report in the book?
Sorry, you've
Councillor
put a cat
Gould,
amongst the pigeons.
can we just perhaps sit down with you with Una in a few moments and just to try to clarify that? Look, can I also go back to this funding discussion, because I think it's useful to actually approach the annual plan process in a slightly different way. I think in the past, if I've got this wrong, and it could stand to be corrected here, there was an assumption that there was a particular bucket of funding available which would produce a particular endpoint with regards to rates and capital and debt. What we're working to, and I think is a very good way of looking at this, is to say you make good decisions, the decisions that you need to make. And then we go back through and to look at the implications of those decisions with respect to what do they mean for debt and rates. Now today, with the Howard Morrison Centre decision, effectively that means a decrease in debt levels as a result. So in other words, the extra borrowing that was going to take place, I think is now going to be reduced by $2 or $3 million or thereabouts. The decision that you've made on the 300k just brings that up a little bit again. So really this is actually just tracking the decisions that you're making, and all of them do have an impact on our bottom line position. It's not a matter of trying to instead try and play a substitution game, because the substitution methodology, which was the old district old annual planning methodology effectively meant you'd take something out of here because you wanted to do something over there. And that really drove you down to a particular decision which was driven more by the financial impact of it than the priorities, if you like, or the importance of the expenditure the importance of the outcome that expenditure was actually geared to produce. So what we're really trying to do is to say, let's walk through all of your submissions. You need to deliberate what are the right decisions that you wish to make, and our job and behind you will be to look at the financial implications of those.
Thank you, Jeff. Councillor Tapsell, you've got a question.
Yeah, just on what you've just mentioned, Jeff. Is it possible for Thomas to, via Excel, just do financial modelling in terms of the additional costs that we may get and what that will lead on to our debt?
It was my intention to do that tomorrow. Yep.
Councillor
It may be very well premature, because we've got a number of submissions that have asked us to increase or decrease in certain activities. And what I thought this process was that we had the 5 conversations. The community came in and discussed or wanted to discuss with us a varied range of issues, which if we don't react to one way or another, we're saying no, we want to carry on its business as usual. But I just want to know how you're going to handle this one. This submission is 26 pages long from the Rotorua District Residents and Ratepayers Association. Now, how do you intend to handle that? Do we pick through it right through each page by page?
I'll stay here for a week.
And or do we just say, accept it and note it, or how do we go through that?
I'll ask Jeff to comment.
So look, there are two points I think to make with regard to that submission. So the submission has been provided to you for your information. So you're able to go through that submission and determine your views as to what needs to be considered or not. From a staff point of view, what staff have tried to identify are those matters pertaining to the annual plan that submission comments on, and to capture those with respect to the summary for these deliberations.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. I put it in the rubbish bin, but never mind.
I'd like to move, Mr Chair, that we go into recess for today. Is that what you
I'll
require?
take one final question and then we will adjourn
Thank you.
our deliberations until tomorrow, 9:30. Councillor Maxwell.
Yeah, just apologies tomorrow about mid-morning for a couple of hours. I've got to head on out and then back again for the submissions and that. So putting my apology in for that. And just Councillor Sturt touched on this. I just offer the support that I noted that Councillor Sturt and yourself present. It was in the media last week, and that I just want to show my support for the comments that you guys made. Support.
Councillor Maxwell, and your apology for part of tomorrow is noted, and the meeting stands adjourned. Thank you, councillors.